Super. All right. Well, we've had a bit of a warm-up for this, so let's try this one more time. Who's excited?
Yay!
Welcome everyone to Trope by Trope, Love's Greatest Hits. My name is Charity. I'm the book curator here at Artifacts, which means that I just spend most of my time with dead people writing, and it is delightful. But it also means that I get to do events like this. And if you've been to one of these before, as some of you have, you'll know kind of how this goes. We'll have this presentation bit, which will be very engaging and insightful and very enriching while still vastly entertaining. How does she do it? And then after that, we will break. We'll have time for some questions. You can come up here and see some of the books that we'll be talking about in here. And then move into the gallery for the second part of the evening, which will be an actual party. So that'll be good. Something to look forward to there. Yes, and that's about it. It's a pretty straightforward experience. All you have to do is just sit there till I tell you you don't have to sit there anymore. Okay, without further ado, let us begin. Before we make the plunge, though, talking about the origin of romance tropes, I want to make a few disclaimers, and the first one is that when we're talking about the origins of anything, it's going to be kind of tricky, it's going to be kind of murky, because with tropes especially, because tropes are the ingredients for the universal, right? And so the very first instance of a trope, of a cliche, might have gone unrecorded, it might be somewhere obscure, it might be in a different language, it just might be somewhere that I don't know about. And so instead of talking about, definitively the first time that enemies to lovers was used, or the first time that a fake relationship was used, we'll talk about the most significant moments in literature and history, the kind of watershed moments of that trope. The second is that love is not an ever-fixed mark, and I don't mean like a slam on Shakespeare's Sonnet 116 when I say this, because I love that poem, but I mean that the way that love has looked, the way that love has been idealized, the way that love has been constructed, even the way that love has been felt, has changed through the centuries. And so just bear that in mind as we're tracking the look of certain types of love throughout history. It might not translate perfectly from what we know today. We're going to focus exclusively on the Western canon because I am but a mere mortal, and I can't fit the entirety of the world in my head, and even if I could, you wouldn't want to sit and hear all of it. That would take forever. So we will just focus mostly on American English and a few other Western writings. Okay. There will be much spoilers, so sorry. We may go over time, but fear not. I have a fail-safe for if we go over time. We'll get to that in a second. And then the last one is I'm really not that qualified to talk about this. I don't read a lot of romance, and in my personal life, I'm abysmal at its application. I'm so bad. When these are the genes that you're working with, you can only do so much. So, with that, let's jump right in. Okay, so, again, if you've been to one of these before, you might kind of have a sense of how these usually go. Sometimes I'll be the one to choose what we start with. Sometimes you'll be the one to choose what we start with. But because we're talking about love, we're going to actually leave it to fate. So, I've got 5 romance tropes here. The fail-safe is that we just don't get to friends to lovers. And I got these tropes from a survey of people willing enough to take it to see which ones were the most popular. And we have them on our little spinner here. So we're going to see where we begin. LOL, we're not starting there. Ooh, enemies to lovers. Okay, let us begin. I don't even know if this will work. There we go. I hope the suspense has been built enough for you. Where is it? Where did it go? Does anyone see it? I feel like Dora. Can you find it now? There! Ah! What? Okay. haven't seen the film 10 Things I Hate About You, in it there is a little piece of literature, a poem, that I think really encapsulates the tension between of enemies to lovers, that tension between hatred and love. So if you wouldn't mind standing up here in front of the class, and reading this original poem, and if you want to make it especially accurate to the movie, you'll begin tearing up right about there. Wherever you feel it. All right.
Right here. This is where I tear.
Wherever your heart tells you. Yeah.
10 Things I Hate About You by Kat
Stratford.
Stratford. I probably should have brought my glasses. I hate the way you talk to me, and I hate the way you cut your hair. I hate the way you drive my car. I hate it when you stare. I hate your big, dumb combat boots and the way you read my mind. I hate you so much that it makes me sick and even makes me rhyme. I hate the way you're always right. I hate it when you lie. I hate it when you make me laugh. Even worse, when you make me cry. I hate it when you're not around. And the fact that you didn't call, but mostly I hate the way I don't hate you. Not even close, not even a little bit, not even at all.
That was beautiful. Julia Stiles, who? So if you haven't seen this movie, like, you're lost, but I hope from the poem that you can kind of get what it's trying to do. Trying to figure out what is the relationship between hatred and love. How close are they really? And something that you may or may not know about this movie, 10 Things I Hate About You, is it is actually based on a Shakespeare play from about 1590, and that is The Taming of the Shrew. A very overgeneralized, sanitized version or plot summary of this play. So you have two people that can't stand each other, they're always butting heads, they end up getting married, and then making peace with each other, depending on how you read it. But so we see Shakespeare kind of toying with this idea of hatred to love, but I don't really think that enemies to lovers takes off until about 10 years later when Shakespeare writes his other play, Much Ado About Nothing. So, Much Ado About Nothing. Basically, we have two sets of lovers. One we don't really care about for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to throw them aside. The other is comprised of Beatrice and Benedict. So Beatrice and Benedict, they have some kind of history together that turned sour. And so now every time they meet, it's a merry war of wits. They're always like duking it out between them. So we will see how this works out for them. So we have Beatrice here, we've got Benedict over there. Remember, they hate each other. Okay.
What, my dear Lady Disdain? Are you yet living? Is it possible Disdain should die while she had such meat food to feed it as Signor Benedict? Courtesy itself must convert to disdain if you come in her presence.
There is courtesy a turncoat, but it is certain I am loved of all ladies, only you excepted, and I would I could find in my heart that I have not a hard heart, but truly I love none.
A dear happiness to women. They would else be troubled with a pernicious suitor.
I do love nothing in the world so well as you. Is not that strange?
I love you with so much of my heart that none is left to protest.
Is the villain in here? That's because we turned the AC off. So, in Much Ado About Nothing, we have the basic plot structure laid out perfectly for us for how enemies to lovers works. We've got the two main characters who are bickering in the beginning, can't stand each other. They each have individual moments of revelation. We have welcome, please take a seat, make yourselves at home. We're just learning how to love thy hated neighbor. So we got two characters, they're battling it out. They each have but then later on they have individual moments of reflection where they realize, hey, wait a second, maybe I love this person, maybe that's what I'm feeling, and then eventually will admit this to each other and reconcile. Now this is done brilliantly in Much Ado About Nothing. Shakespeare executes it just to perfection, and it's the part of the play that for successive centuries people remember best. I mean, it's referred to throughout the centuries often as the Beatrice and Benedict play. But what I think is interesting is, as well as this works, Enemies to Lovers is still not something you see a lot of in those successive centuries. And I think a big part of this is because Enemies to Lovers didn't quite match up with the ideals about love that existed in Shakespeare's time. Christopher Marlowe, a friend of Shakespeare, wrote this question in a poem, Hero and Leander: whoever loved that loved not at first sight. And so the idea was, the common idea was that you would fall in love at first sight because their beauty and their virtue would be evident to you from the beginning. Like if there's something that's getting in the way of you seeing that beauty and virtue, like is it really love? You should be able to see their character shine forth no matter what. And so as the centuries go on, Enemies to Lovers, as great as it can work and has been proven to work, isn't nearly as popular as it is today. And so a couple centuries after Much Ado About Nothing, when a novel is published in 1813 that includes an Enemies to Lovers plot, Beatrice and Benedict are still people's go-to. That's still fresh on their minds. In an earlier review of this novel, kind of called that out, called the heroine, Elizabeth, the Beatrice of the tale. This novel is, of course, very, very well done, which we have in first edition here if you want to see it after. So, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. The premise of this is that you've got Mr. Darcy, the Benedict of the tale, Elizabeth, the Beatrice of the tale, who they meet, kind of get off on the wrong foot, they kind of clash a bit, but Mr. Darcy is quicker to warm to Elizabeth than she is to him. And so about halfway through the novel, he proposes to her, much to her shock, dismay, and even disgust. So we're going to see how that goes.
You're mistaken, Mr. Darcy. The motive of your declaration merely spared me any concern I might have felt in refusing you, having behaved in a more gentlemanlike manner. And in any possible way, from the very beginning, your manners impressed me with the fullest belief of your arrogance, your conceit, and your self-disdain for these errors. I did not know you were much before I felt you were the last man in the world whom I would ever marry. Turn down the
Legend! She's a legend! I mean, look at that! Daggers from the eyes! It's brilliant, it's wonderful. As you can see, even without the beautiful editing, that tension is just so palpable. We love it. We eat it up. And it works. It works so well. But of course, as the novel goes on, Elizabeth realizes that she's been mistaken about Darcy's character and kind of mends her ways. And Darcy, meanwhile, realizes the mistakes in his character and tries to correct them. And so, by the end of the novel, he proposes again. She says yes. But everyone is so weirded out by this. I mean, when Lizzie's dad gives Darcy his blessing to marry Elizabeth, all the pronouns, he says, "Lizzie, what are you doing? Are you out of your senses to be accepting this man? Have you not always hated him?" She's like, "Well, do you have any other issues besides, my apparent indifference to him?" And he's like, "Well, I mean, if you like him, then go for it." And she says, I do like him. I love him. He and I said so. And again, here, as in Much Ado About Nothing, it is brilliantly executed. Austen does a wonderful job of this. Pride and Prejudice is Austen's most successful novel of hers within her lifetime, and has been her most popular novel ever since. And a big reason for this is because it does that Enemies to Lovers thing so well. It kind of sets the new standard, right? But we're in 1813, and even in the 19th century, things have progressed, a bit since the 17th century. But we're still kind of in our heads about the Enemies to Lovers thing. It still doesn't quite match up with how love is supposed to look in Regency and then Victorian times. However, not everyone is blind to how well Pride and Prejudice works, or Enemies to Lovers works. In fact, Victorian novelist Elizabeth Gaskell almost completely copies and pastes the romantic plot of Pride and Prejudice onto her novel North and South, where you have two characters, there's John Thornton and Margaret Hale, hate each other in the beginning, they're going, but Thornton warms up to Margaret faster than she warms up to him, and so halfway through the novel he proposes, much to her shock, dismay, and disgust. And one thing that I think is fun about his proposal is he completely calls out the trope. He says, I know you despise me. I know we're enemies. Allow me to say it. It is because you do not understand me, which is, of course, the way enemies to lovers goes. There's always just some big misunderstanding between them. And just because I think it's worth reading, we'll just skip down to this little paragraph here where he also says, one word more. You look as if you thought it tainted you to be loved by me. You cannot avoid it. Nay, I, if I would, cannot cleanse you from it. But I would not if I could. I have never loved any woman before. My life has been too busy, my thoughts absorbed with other things. Now I love and will love. And again, here it's masterfully done. North and South is a beautiful novel, as is the 2004 miniseries. But it's really not going to be until we get to the 20th century that enemies to lovers can really take off. Because by this point, the way that love can look in people's minds has expanded enough to allow for something other than love at first sight, or even just liking each other from the beginning. So we're going to have one more masterclass writer kind of show us how it's done, and that is, of course, Ella Montgomery in Anne of Green Gables, which we have in first edition here. This is first edition of Anne of the Island, which is when Anne and Gilbert finally get together. But the way that she sets up their relationship is Gilbert Blythe is the most handsome boy in the school, and he kind of takes a fancy to this new girl, Anne Shirley, and wants to get her attention. And so, of course, his method of doing this is by taunting her. She's very sensitive about her red hair, and so when he tries to catch her attention by calling her carrots, she looks at him with a vengeance, and then exclaims passionately, "You mean, hateful boy, how dare you!" And then thwack! Anne had brought her slate down on Gilbert's head and cracked it, slate not head, clear across. And then, later on in Anne of the Island, she's finally going to realize that she loved him all along. But I think what's so wonderful about this is it is such a subversion, of the love at first sight thing. It is, dare I say, love at first slate. And it's just perfect. It's just wonderful. Highly recommend the 85 miniseries and then also the book. But as you're going to see as a pattern throughout the rest of this presentation, it really, I think, is Hollywood that's going to make these tropes into the tropes that we know and love today. Because Hollywood brings it not just to readers, but to anyone who's willing to, sit down and watch something for a couple of hours. So if you look at some of the golden age Hollywood rom-coms, you'll find enemies to lovers as the basis, kind of basic love story. And it works really well. They're received really well. In fact, The Shop Around the Corner does so well for itself that it's remade a few times into also very successful movies in their own right. So we've got In the Good Old Summertime about a decade after, which is a musical version starring Judy Garland, and then of course the rom-com to end all rom-coms, and that's You Got Mail. And the story of all of these is you've got your enemies, you've got two people who hate each other, but unbeknownst to them are in love with each other because they've been anonymously corresponding, and so have fallen in love with their pen pal, not knowing that their pen pal is their sworn enemy, and it is excellent. And one thing that I think is really, really great about You've Got Mail in particular is it's so clever, it's so smart, it has such a deep understanding of where this trope really came from, and references the novel Pride and Prejudice quite a few times throughout the film. And just because we're on the subject of films making an homage to their origins, their roots, just about a year and a half ago, I think, this movie came out, Anyone But You, which is a modern retelling of Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing. So this is what we call in the trade a full circle moment. And then since then, enemies to lovers, you can't get away from it. You really can't. Here are just a few examples from film that uses the trope. It's fun. We love it. It's great. It's like the golden child now of romance. But it took some getting there, right? So why does it work? I think that, to put it simply, it's because there's always a tension that exists between the two lovers, the two characters, and it's always a tension that's rooted in passion. And I think it's also really fun for us to try to figure out where is the line between hate and love, how thin is it, and how often is it blurred. It's just a fun little psychological exercise for us. Do we have any questions or anything at this point before we move on to the next trope? I'm glad I explained it so completely. You have nothing left to say. Okay, so, oh no. Okay. I'm not letting my eye off this thing. Okay. Most stressful part of my day. Okay. Forced proximity. Ooh. Yes, let's. Okay. Oh no, I lost it again. This is such a fun game, isn't it? Okay, what was it? Forced proximity?
Yes.
I promise you, last night I had no trouble whatsoever. I don't even know.
Oh, there it is.
Oh, is it being weird? Okay, there we go. Okay, forced proximity. So, very kind of technical term for a romance trope. So what it basically means is you have two characters, okay, who are forced to share close proximity with each other, okay? Now, to give you a basic idea, a little blueprint of how this trope works, we're going to enlist the help of the film Tangled, 2010. See how forced proximity works in 5 easy steps. So the first step, of course, is the setup. Why are they forced to share close proximity anyway?
Let me just get this straight. I take you to see the lanterns, bring you back home, and you'll give me back my satchel?
I promise.
Fine, I'll take you to see the lanterns.
Really? Oops.
You broke my shoulder.
They are then forced to bond.
My real name is Eugene Fitzherbert.
Feelings get caught. Which then leads to love. Dare I say it? Even true love. Anyway, we're gonna leave it on that happy note. If you want to know if true love prevails in the end, you can watch the movie. So there we go. That's how it works. Something that I think is interesting though about forced proximity is it's kind of the oldest trope in the book, and by the book I mean the capital B book, and by the capital E book I mean the Bible. Because in the beginning, we have God who creates man and decides it is not good for man to be alone, and so also creates woman. And then puts them together, forces them to share close proximity in the Garden of Eden. Which, this painting would have you believe they really could spend years without seeing each other, but they don't. They love each other so much. And so they stay together, and when they're exiled, it's kind of like the first rom-com road trip. In a way, if you'll pardon the maybe blasphemy. But if we turn to another source, another work of ancient literature, we'll see forced proximity again, and in kind of a familiar iteration of it. So in the Aeneid, an ancient Roman poem by Virgil, we have Aeneas, who finds himself on a hunting trip with Dido, Queen of Carthage. And on this hunting trip, night begins to fall, a storm begins to brew, and so they decide they need to take shelter. So they go to a cave, but here's the catch. There's only one cave. And so some stuff goes down in said cave, which for the sensitivity of our viewers, we won't discuss here. Now, if that sounds a little bit familiar, if that is ringing some kind of a bell for you, chances are, at some point in your life, you've come across a book or a movie or a TV show that has the two main characters who are caught in a dark and stormy night, so have to take refuge in an inn. And when they get to the inn, what do they hear? There's only one bed. Oh no. So we already kind of see a prototype of this in the Aeneid. But I don't think that the only one bed trope as the recognizable kind of rom-com trope is really established until the 1934 film Frank Capra, It Happened One Night. So Basically, what happens in this movie, which is very, very good, highly recommend, you've got Peter, who's a journalist, and Ellie, who is an heiress. Ellie is running away from home, and she's enlisted the help of Peter, who in exchange for his help, she'll allow to, write a story about her. And they're caught, as, it happens in a dark and stormy night, and so have to take shelter in the same cabin. And granted, there are 2 beds in the cabin, but the principle is the same. The tension is the same, as we are about to witness.
You've got everything nicely figured out for yourself, including this.
This? Well, that's a matter of simple mathematics. These cabins cost $2 a night. And I'm very sorry to inform you, my dear, that the family first will stand for our having separatist efforts. Behold the walls of Jericho. Maybe not as thick as the ones that Joshua blew down with his trumpet, but a lot safer. You see, I have no trouble. Now, just to show you my heart's in the right place, I'll give you my best pair of pajamas. If you take those things off the walls of Jericho.
Oh, beautiful.
Goodness, cut that tension with a knife. Even though there are 2 beds, I mean, that forced intimacy, almost to the point of crossing the platonic line, is still there. And is going to be used again and again and again in successive decades. And if you are a stickler about the fact that It Happened One Night there are 2 beds, well, next year, 1935, in Alfred Hitchcock's 39 Steps, when the hero and the heroine are caught in a dark and stormy night and make their way into an inn and book a room, there is only 1 bed in the room, and it's delightful. But there's only 1 bed, of course. It's a version of forced proximity, but it's a very specific version of forced proximity, and one that you're not going to see, every single time. A much more general use of the trope is just they're on a journey together. In the medieval poem Tristan and Isolde, basically what happens, the way that these 2 fall in love, is they're not in love before they get on the boat. In fact, they kind of hate each other a little bit. But by the time they're off the boat, they are madly in love. And, they do drink a love potion while they are on the boat, but that's beside the point. The fact is, they fall in love when they're on a boat and they're on a journey together because they're forced together. And this is something that you're going to see again and again and again. I mean, the golden age of Hollywood loved this kind of thing, and some of the greatest films of the golden age use this method. And oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. This happens sometimes so much. Sorry, anyways, children's animated films also love using this trope because it's a very safe way to fall in love, right? I mean, all you have to do is just walk together, and that's it. It's harmless. And I think what's interesting too is this, apparently works so well that every princess movie that Disney made for that little stretch there had the same basic plot. 2 characters who don't get along super well go on a journey together, and how about that, they're in love. Blockbusters will resort to this trope often, and I mean, it's because it's a really easy way to shoehorn a love story into a plot, because you already have a main character who has a goal. Now just give their love interest the same goal and off they go together. Rom-coms, of course, also are going to use this. So why does it work? Why do we love it so much? And we've touched on it already a bit, where they're forced to be as intimate as they can be without crossing that platonic line. But it's not just that, it's that they're depending on each other, they're seeing each other at their worst, they're seeing each other at their best, they're getting just a very well-rounded picture of who the other person is. Are there any questions here before we move on? Or comments? Charity, where can I watch It Happened One Night? The Internet Archive for free. Okay, so don't lose sight. I'm gonna have nightmares about this. Okay. Fake relationship. Okay, I wonder what's that. To get ourselves in the right headspace, let's just rewind a few years to 2020, when the first season of Bridgerton debuts, which I will admit right now I haven't seen, but I know well enough that the premise of the first season is that the Duke, Simon, and Daphne decide for their mutual benefit they're going to fake a courtship. Or as Simon says, ha ha ha.
We could pretend to form an attachment.
In American, that's we could pretend to form an attachment. Now, before we go on with this, I do want to just make one note that when we're talking about fake dating throughout history, it's a bit complicated because the way that dating and courtship has looked through history has changed dramatically. And so there are just some things about fake dating as we see it now that just can't translate to other time periods. For instance, in the Regency period, which is when Bridgerton is set, if a man were to say to a woman,
We could pretend to form an attachment.
it's not very likely that it would go super well for them. I mean, if we look at a novel that was published during the Regency period, Persuasion by Jane Austen, this was 1817, we have the hero, Wentworth, who engages in a little flirtation with this one girl, Louisa. Now to him, it's a very harmless flirtation. It's just playful, it's just for fun. But at one point in the novel, he realizes that everyone around him seems to have taken this flirtation to mean a lot more than he intended. And so that expectation that everyone has that they will get married, even though he has said nothing about that, is enough for him to feel honor-bound to marry Louisa if she'll have him. And a note too is that if a man and woman are engaged or are expected to be engaged, and the man breaks off the engagement, the woman's reputation is now sullied forever. And so to just waltz up to someone, fake an engagement, and then, leave unscathed without having to get married or whatever, it wasn't very likely. You'd have to commit to the bit if you wanted to keep your reputations intact. And that, of course, means not just a fake engagement, but an actual lawfully recognized marriage. I will also say that from this point forward, at least in this section, he will be there in the corner for whenever we feel like there is need to say,
We could pretend to form an attachment.
just let me know. So, if fake dating, if it's a hard one to pin the origins for, if it doesn't work perfectly in most historical eras, then where do we want to start with it? Well, I actually do want to start before the Regency period, to Shakespeare's play As You Like It. The love story of this play is as follows. We have Orlando, who falls in love with Rosalind, and I'm just saying she's Rosalind because in my head she's always been a brunette. But Rosalind falls in love with Orlando. Some stuff goes down, Orlando is exiled to the forest. Some other stuff goes down. Rosalind and her cousin Celia also go into the forest. But because it would have been just unheard of for two young women to go off into a forest alone, Rosalind dresses up as a boy and calls herself Ganymede. And while they're all in the woods, Rosalind and Orlando and Celia run into each other. Now, what has Orlando been doing all this time in the woods? Well, he's been pining for Rosalind. He's been writing love letters to her, pinning them up to trees, pine trees, if you will. And so when Rosalind bumps into him, she's like, okay, I think maybe you have a little bit of a problem. What we're going to do is, I don't know, let's say I'll pretend to be Rosalind, and you can pretend to woo me, and I can give you some pointers. And he's like, kind of weird, but okay. And so they do. And at one point, they even pretend to get married. Now, there are a lot of things to be said about this scene, many, many things. I'm not going to say most of them, except that I do think one of the sweetest lines in all of literature comes from this scene. And it's when Rosalind, as Ganymede, asks Orlando, now tell me, how long you would have her after you have possessed her, Rosalind? And he says, forever and a day. Oh, eternity. Oh, thank you. Now, you might not be completely convinced, of course, that this is an instance of fake dating. And again, it doesn't quite work because they're not both in on it, And I really don't think that fake dating is going to become a recognizable thing that we see again and again and again until the 20th century, when, once more, ideas about dating and courtship have expanded enough to allow that sort of thing. And one of the prototypes in the early 20th century that we're going to see of fake dating is the marriage of convenience. again, the relationship isn't quite fake, because when two people get married, even if it's just for their own benefit, and the marriage is a front to them, it's still legally recognized as a valid relationship. One of the first instances in literature that I found, though, of the marriage of convenience, I think works especially well for thinking about fake dating. It's Edith Wharton's The Glimpses of the Moon, 1922 novel, and so good, I would highly recommend. And the premise of this is you have Nick, the hero, Susie, the heroine, and they devise a shrewd bargain. They'll marry and spend a year or so sponging off their wealthy friends, honeymooning in their mansions and villas. The other part of the plan is that if either one of them meets someone who can advance them socially, they're free to dissolve the marriage. I mean, it's kind of like the contract in fake dating, where, yes, it is still a legitimate marriage that they have, but in their minds, it isn't legitimate enough that like a dissolution of it would be like a huge deal. Like they can walk away from it as if they're just breaking up. Now, once more, you might not be totally convinced, but whether you are convinced or not that this is kind of fake dating, I will say that there are several instances in the novel where each character has moments of reflection where they're like, maybe I don't want this marriage dissolved. Maybe I kind of like being married to this other person. Maybe I'm in love with this other person. And by the end of the book, the kind of agreement that they come to is much like this line in the proposal from 2009, which by this point, fake dating is a much established trope, where Andrew says to Margaret, "Marry me because I'd like to date you." So even though the relationship in Glimpses of the Moon isn't fake, it still operates on very similar lines to what you'll see in fake dating movies or books or whatever. But again, we must bring Hollywood into the discussion, because this is where a lot of these tropes go mainstream. This is where they hit mass markets as they've never seen before. And what have we seen this before? Is it It Happened One Night by Frank Capra? Yes, it is. So just a quick refresher, we've got Ellie, the runaway heiress, and Peter, the journalist. Now, because Ellie is a runaway heiress, her dad has the means to send private detectives off to hunt for her. I think that's all the context that you really need to know for this scene. And oh no, it's happening again. I'm so embarrassed. This is unconscionable. Okay.
That's my wife you're talking to. What do you mean, come here? What do you want anyway?
We're looking for somebody.
Yeah, well, look your head up. They'll come busting in here. This is a public park. I can do is take a sock at you.
Take it easy, son. Take it easy. These family detectives.
I don't care. They're the whole police department. They can't come busting in here shooting questions in my face.
Yeah, don't get too excited, Peter. They just ask you simple questions.
Oh, is that so? Say, how many times have I told you to stop butting in when I'm having an argument?
We don't have to get that far.
That's what he said the other time, too. Every time I try to protect you. The other night, we all stand with that big sweep in there past that.
He ain't passing up now. I told you we didn't stop.
No, I saw him. Kept pointing all over the dance floor.
He didn't. You were wrong.
No.
And it was all an act. They're not even married, really. So we finally made it. The relationship is fake. Yay! And the fake relationship is going to be something that we see again and again and again and again in rom-coms. And in the past, in the recent, what am I saying? In the past couple of years, we've kind of seen a resurgence in the rom-com genre. And coming with that, of course, there is a resurgence in the fake dating trope, which I think is kind of a heartwarming underdog story in its way, where it takes so long for fake dating to finally get off the ground, but when it does, it soars. And I mean, even so much that, like in blockbuster movies, it seeped its way in. So why does fake dating work? Well, why does the trope fake dating appeal? Maybe I should say it that way. I think it's much the same principles as forced proximity, where they're depending on each other. They're, always with each other. They're seeing each other in the highs and in the lows, but they're also seeing each other as kind of a prospective partner. It's like a free trial run. you know, and so they have some time before they actually have to commit to anything to go, would this actually work if it were real? And it's such beautiful tension. Okay, so that then leaves us, ooh, I'm excited for this one, for forbidden love. Okay, so to get in the right mindset for forbidden love, I think we need to go back to the year 1997. And fortunately, I have a time machine. Here it is. So we're just gonna sing with me. Anyway, now that you're really uncomfortable with each other, 1997, Leonardo DiCaprio stars in Titanic. It's this enormous blockbuster, this tale of tragic, forbidden love that features him in key scenes with wet hair. A year before, where do we see Leonardo DiCaprio in scenes with wet hair? Why, it's another epic blockbuster film of tragic and forbidden love, and that is, of course, Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet. So, Romeo and Juliet by William Shakespeare. If you've been living under a rock for the past 400 years, I'm glad that it was this that got you to come out from under your rock. But the basic outline of Romeo and Juliet is you've got two households, both alike in dignity and fair, Verona, Marie Laerstein, etc. And one of the households is the Montagues, the other household is the Capulets. For the Montagues, there's a boy, Romeo. From the Capulets, there's a girl. How did you know? Oh my goodness. And they both fall in love, even though their families hate each other. Some stuff goes down, and they end up getting married in secret, and then some other stuff goes down, and they end up dying for love, and with their death, bury their parents' strife. Now, this is not the first, of course, story of forbidden love. It's not even the first story of forbidden love to have two clashing households against each other. 1600 years before, the story Pyramus and Thisbe was recorded by Ovid, and in it we have, like in Romeo and Juliet, two kind of warring families that produce, children who fall in love with each other, Pyramus and Thisbe. But the only way that Pyramus and Thisbe can contact each other is through a little chink in the wall. They eventually run away into the forest together, where they die. But one thing that I think is interesting about Pyramus and Thisbe in connection to Romeo and Juliet is not just that they share a lot of the same plot elements, but also because at the time that Shakespeare's writing Romeo and Juliet, he's also writing A Midsummer Night's Dream, which is another story that hinges on two forbidden lovers trying to make their way in the world. But in A Midsummer Night's Dream, there's a group of characters toward the end that stage a play of Pyramus and Thisbe. And so we see Shakespeare is really, he's very conscious of these connections. He's very deliberate in the way that these overlap with each other. He's putting them in conversation with each other. And in doing this, creates in Romeo and Juliet kind of the definitive, the gold standard of a forbidden love story. The one that we just can't get away from when we think of forbidden love. I mean, even in more modern times, when we have a movie like Titanic, we can't get Romeo and Juliet out of its DNA. The director James Cameron called it Romeo and Juliet on that ship, meaning the Titanic. And again, let's just reinforce that Leo stars in both of them, so there's obviously something going on here. And because we're just on a roll, making all these connections, let's talk about another forbidden love story. Let's talk about High School Musical. So in High School Musical, we have our warring factions. We've got the jocks and we've got the nerds. From the jocks, we have Try, the basketball guy, and from the nerds, we have Gabriella, freaky nerd girl, and they fall in love, much to their, warring factions' chagrin. Now, this feels quite a lot like Romeo and Juliet, just by the way that the plot is structured. But another wild connection between the two is that Zac Efron looks suspiciously like the guy who plays Romeo in Franco Zeffirelli's 1968 production of Romeo and Juliet. And again, because we were on such a roll making connections, why don't we make one more? So, Disney produced High School Musical. Disney also produced a few years earlier its own version of Romeo and Juliet. Does anybody know what it is? No. That was after it's also not Disney. But nice try. Is gravity for all forbidden love stories. It's sort of the linchpin. All roads lead to Romeo and Juliet when we're talking about forbidden love. But something that I think is interesting about Romeo and Juliet is that even though it gives us the blueprint for forbidden love stories, it doesn't actually give us the reason why the love is forbidden in the first place. So we know that the Montagues and the Capulets hate each other, but no one by this point actually knows why, what the ancient grudge was. By this point, it's nothing but an airy word. In a lot of adaptations of Romeo and Juliet, they kind of gloss over this and give very explicit reasons why the two sides hate each other. In the 1961 film West Side Story, for instance, we have really, really clear reasons for the animosity between the two. We've got class divides, but I think more importantly, ethnic divides. We've got the Puerto Rican gang, the Sharks, versus the Italian-American gang, the Jets. And in Lion King 2, Simba's Pride, we also have geographic divides, we kind of have class divides, and we also have a very, very fresh memory of that grudge. It is not an airy word here. We all remember exactly what it is that Simba did to Scar. So if Romeo and Juliet is going to give us every reason for every kind of a template for forbidden love, except why the love is forbidden, then why is the love usually going to be forbidden in these stories? Well, if you look through the annals of time, as I have, you will find that one of the biggest reasons is class. In pre-Romeo and Juliet days, for instance, we've got medieval literature, and when love is forbidden, it's often going to be because of class differences. In Apollon and Nicolette, it's an upper-class knight falls in love with a lower-class maiden, and Frederica's Falcon, which is from the Decameron, it's an upper-class woman falls in love with a poor man. If we skip forward to the rise of the novel, we've got lower-class man, upper-class woman, lower-class man, upper-class woman, lower-class man, upper-class woman. You see the pattern into the 20th century when we get a story like Great Gatsby, where again, it is lower-class man, upper-class woman. But something to note about Great Gatsby is that it's not just that Gatsby falls in love with Daisy despite the class difference between them. It's almost he falls in love with her because of the class difference between them. Because for him, one of the biggest attractions for him is that she embodies wealth, she embodies the American dream, she embodies prosperity. He puts her up on a pedestal and says that that pedestal is her greatest virtue. And so but they don't get married. And the reason that he gives is that there was, that divide, that he was too poor and she wasn't willing to wait. Or as Dimitri and Anastasia might eloquently put it, princesses don't marry pigeon boys. Which, interestingly, is usually going to be the dynamic. It's usually going to be a princess and a pigeon boy. I won't go into my theories as to why it's usually this way. If you're really curious, you can talk to me after. But in most instances, not all, but in most instances, it is usually going to be that upper class woman, lower class man. Anyway, but if you look, okay, well, if it's not class divide, then what is it? It's often going to be that there's an existing attachment with at least one of the characters. Like, okay, let's just do a little exercise, shall we? Let's go back to myth, let's go back to legend, let's go back to, the most ancient literature we can think of, and with the most famous couples there, what is going to be the issue? If they cannot be wed together, it's usually going to be that she's married already. With Helen and Paris in the Iliad, that's what it is. Lancelot and Guinevere in the King Arthur stories, that's what it is. Tristan and Isolde, that's what it is. She's married, she's married, she's married. And with some of the great, forbidden love stories in the 19th and 20th centuries, that's also going to be the case. Anna Karenina, she's married. The Awakening, she's married. Age of Innocence, actually he's engaged. Great Gatsby, she's married. And sorry Tolstoy for reducing Anna Karenina to she's married. But with like some of the great sweeping romances of Hollywood too, some of the movies that are heralded as like the greatest love stories in cinema, often she's already married or engaged. In the case of Gone with the Wind, Scarlett O'Hara is married like 30,000 times before she gets with Rhett Butler, which, by the way, we do have a first edition of Gone with the Wind here. So what I want you to do then is just, think of all of the power and majesty that comes from, and the legacy that comes from class divides and forbidden love stories. think of the legacy of existing attachments and like all the stories that exist there, put them together, and of course you're going to have something with, you know, on a grand scale as this. Anyway, there are going to be other obstacles, of course. For example, there might be kind of an insurmountable age difference. There might be religious differences. Religious differences. There might be such issues as the law, like in the case of Brokeback Mountain, homosexuality is illegal. So you know, what are they going to do? And there's also issues of like whatever. So why does forbidden love work? Why have we just lapped this trope up from the very beginning? I think again it's a pretty simple principle, is that there's already kind of a danger, already kind of a thrill, a risk to falling in love. And so when you add to it the risk of you're not supposed to be doing it with this person anyway, then can it get any better? And then there's also that just old principle that of the forbidden fruit, where it's going to taste all the sweeter because you're not supposed to have it. So there is that. So any questions there? Super. Okay, we will now move on. And if you are really interested in the Friends to Lovers, when we break and go into the gallery, if you want to stay after, we can talk about that, but there's no pressure at all. Okay, so I kind of got that out of the way. Are there really no questions? Cool, okay. So if you enjoyed yourself here and want to kind of keep tabs on other activities that we're doing at Artifacts, on March 1st, that's a week from today, at 3 p.m., we're going to be meeting, our book club is going to be meeting to discuss Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson. We're going to have a St. Patrick's Day sale in a few weeks, yay! Our next big monthly activity, our March activity, is going to be a papermaking workshop on Saturday the 22nd. If you want to get especially ahead of the game with the following book club meeting, on March 29th, we're going to discuss Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, which is delicious. It is such a good novel. And then the next event like this, like a presentation-based one, is going to be about children's literature, which I think will be a lot of fun. And that will probably be April 26th, TBD though. And before I let you go completely, a couple more things I want to say is that if you do want to keep up with what our bookstore is doing, you can follow us on Instagram or Facebook. And lastly, we love doing these events. They're a lot of fun, but we also want to make sure that we're always giving the people what they want. And so this QR code and this link will take you to a survey. If you could please fill that out, that would be excellent. It would be enormously helpful. All the questions are optional and they are anonymous, so please answer as many or as honestly as you can. And this QR code is also in the gallery too, if you want to just fill it out there as well. And with that, I don't think there is anything else except for the transition to the next part of the evening. At Artifacts, we have a beloved tradition, a cult favorite, to help us kind of get in the mood, get in the party spirit for the second half of the evening. Does anybody know what it is?
Jazz